It's a done deal, Dean. Bay State's signing Friday. Dad already gave his blessing, so I don't want to hear another word about it. My father said that standing in the radio shack at the end of my grandfather's dock, holding a folder of paperwork against the counter like the paper itself, was the only argument he needed. My mother stood in the doorway behind him, arms crossed, looking out at the water the way she always looked at the water when my father had already decided how a conversation was going to end before it started. I looked past both of them at my grandfather, sitting in the old bentwood chair beside the marine radio base station, running one finger slowly along the edge of the logbook like he was reading something only he could hear inside the pages. I asked to see the authorization page. My father found it and turned it toward me a beat too fast, like he'd rehearsed exactly how long to hold it up before pulling it back. I had watched that man sign his name on 100 fuel invoices and boat titles my entire life. A broad, unhurried E that always started a fraction high before it settled, a signature built by 50 years of a hand that never once had to rush anything on the water. This signature didn't settle. It just stopped, the way a line stops when somebody's hand is moving faster than their memory of how the letter actually goes. I didn't say anything that afternoon. I picked up a coil of dock line and kept my hands busy, because that is what I had learned to do around my father a long time before that day. Keep working, keep quiet, and remember everything, because sooner or later somebody in this family was going to need the version of events that didn't get edited. 6 weeks later, at the Harlow Point Fishing Derby's awards night, in front of nearly every commercial fisherman and charter captain on that stretch of the Maine coast, an old marine radio my grandfather had kept switched on at that dock for over 50 years would have its recordings played back through a borrowed PA system, and the voice that came out of those speakers would end my father's lease deal, my brother's boat buying plans, and a story my family had spent almost a year quietly building about a confused old fisherman who couldn't be trusted to run his own dock anymore. My name is Dean Marsh. I'm 31 years old, and I've been the marine mechanic at my grandfather's boatyard since I was 19, which means I've spent over a decade with my hands inside other men's engines, learning exactly how much you can tell about a machine's real condition just by listening closely enough. If you've ever watched somebody try to quietly take something out from under a person everyone assumed had already stopped paying attention, stay with me to the end, because my grandfather taught an entire harbor that the man who talks the least on a radio channel is usually the one who's heard everything worth hearing. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. And if you're the kind of person who stays until a story's finished, subscribe now, because what my grandfather recorded on that old radio took him the better part of a year to gather, and it's going to take me the next 2 hours to tell you WHYTO understand what happened at that derby. You need to understand a dock that stood at the mouth of Harlow Point since 1968, a radio shack that smelled permanently of diesel and brine, and a family that had quietly decided, long before I was old enough to notice, exactly which son's word carried weight and which one was simply expected to keep the engines running. Harlow Point, Maine, sits along a working stretch of coastline about 50 minutes north of the nearest real town, population just under 2,800, the kind of place where the harbour master's office still runs off a coffee can of loose change for the community VHF radio's electric bill, and half the commercial boats tied up on a given morning are older than the men running them. My grandfather, Elias Marsh, built the dock and boatyard himself starting in 1968, on a stretch of shoreline his own father had fished from a rowboat, and he ran it for 56 years, hauling boats, fixing hulls, and, most importantly to the working fleet up and down that coast, keeping a stretch of commercial dock space open at a fair, unchanging rate to any fisherman who needed it, rich season or lean one. He'd been a radioman in the Coast Guard before he came home to build the dock, and he ran the marine radio out of that shack like it was a second occupation for the rest of his life, relaying weather, coordinating who tied up where during a crowded Derby weekend, talking half-frozen crews through engine trouble on Channel 68 at 2 in the morning more times than anyone could count. Boats up and down that coast still call the dock marshes out of habit, 60 years after the sign went up. My grandmother, Constance Marsh, Connie, to everyone who knew her, kept the books for the dock until she passed in 2017. I was 24. My grandfather closed the shack for exactly 3 days and then reopened it, because he told me once that a radio operator who goes dark for too long makes every boat still out there wonder if something's wrong, and he wasn't going to be the reason anybody worried. He had 2 sons. My father, Roger, and my uncle Neil, who moved down to Portsmouth in the early 2000s to work in commercial shipping and calls twice a year, which, looking back, may have been the smartest decision anyone in that family ever made. My father married my mother, Sandra, in 1990. My mother taught elementary school in the next town over for almost 30 years, steady and unremarkable in every way that mattered to this story, and over the years she built an entire personality around not disagreeing with my father louder than he was willing to be disagreed with. I was born in 1993. My brother Cody came 3 years later, and was golden in a way I understood without anyone ever having to explain it to me. There's a photograph from a 4th of July cookout when I was maybe 10. Cody had knocked an entire cooler of ice off the dock reaching for a soda he'd already been handed once. My father's exact words, and I remember them precisely because some version of them followed me my entire childhood, were, "Dean, why weren't you watching where he was standing?" I was coiling line 8 feet away. Nobody had assigned me to watch him. I said I was sorry anyway, because that's what you learn to do at 10 years old when the story's already been written and you're only being told which part you play in it. By the time I was 13, I understood the shape of it completely. Cody was the one whose little league trophies got displayed on the mantel, whose fishing derby entries my father entered and paid for every single year, whose eventual failures, and there would be several, always arrived pre-forgiven, wrapped in some story about how a boy with big dreams takes bigger risks. I was the reliable one, which in my family was never a compliment. It was a job assignment. Reliable meant nobody had to manage you. Reliable meant whatever attention was left over after Cody's ambitions were funded, you understood, without being told twice, that it wasn't coming your way. My grandfather never played that game. From the time I was 9, every day after school, I walked the half-mile down to the dock and sat on an overturned 5-gallon bucket in the boatyard, handing him tools before he asked for them, learning to read a strained engine by ear before I could properly read a repair manual. By 15, I could diagnose a failing water pump by the sound of the belt alone. By 19, he'd started letting me run the whole mechanical side of the yard on the days his own hands weren't steady enough for fine work anymore. "You've got a mechanic's ear," he told me once. I was maybe 14. "Your brother's got his father's mouth. Good for some things. But a mouth's never once told you what's actually wrong with an engine. Only listening does that." I didn't fully understand what he meant then. I understood it completely by the time I was 31. Cody wanted nothing to do with engine grease or dock lines. By 17 he'd decided, in his words, that he was built for the front of the boat, not the back of the engine room, which over the following decade translated into an unfinished business degree, a failed sport fishing charter he ran alone for one disastrous season in 2019, and, more recently, the ambition he'd been talking about at every family dinner for 2 years running, expanding into marsh sport fishing charters. A proper 2-boat operation, which needed, by his own repeated estimate, somewhere around $85,000 in startup capital he did not have and had never been asked how he planned to get. I want to be clear that I loved my brother. I still do, in the complicated way you love someone you've watched be excused from consequences his entire life and have quietly, resentfully made peace with never being excused from anything yourself. This isn't his villain origin story. That belongs to somebody else. But you need to understand the machinery of that dock and that family before I show you what it was built to hide. I got my marine mechanic certification through a program 2 hours south, came home in 2015, and never really left the boatyard again. I make $46,000 a year plus whatever side engine work I pick up in the off-season. I drive a 2013 Ford pickup with a cracked tailgate latch I've been meaning to fix since the derby before last. I am not, by any definition my father would recognize, a person who was going somewhere. I never went looking to be one. What I was, without ever deciding to be, was the only son who still showed up at that boatyard every single working day the tide came in. My grandfather's memory started slipping in earnest in the winter of 2021. Small things first, a boat owner's name briefly gone and then back a moment later, a fuel invoice logged twice in the same week without him noticing, a story about a storm season repeated almost word for word within the same conversation. By the spring of 2022, the clinic up in the county seat used the word concerning. By that fall, a specialist down in Portland used the words early vascular dementia, and told us that with support and routine, he could likely keep running the radio shack and overseeing the yard for years yet, provided somebody was paying close attention on the days his judgment wasn't reliable. I want to say the family adjusted together. We didn't. What actually happened is that I started coming in an hour before the yard officially opened every single morning to quietly check whatever paperwork he'd handled the evening before. My mother stopped by most Sundays with a casserole and left within the hour. My father came when it suited the doc's business and not otherwise, and my brother Cody, who lived 20 minutes away, visited the yard exactly 9 times over the following 18 months, 6 of which I have specific memory of because they coincided with a conversation about the new boat. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because the doc's own daily log, an actual bound logbook, the kind Coast Guard radiomen have kept since before either of us was born, 1 entry per shift, who came in and what was handled, became, without my ever intending it to, one of the most honest records that family has ever produced. My initials appear in that logbook nearly every working day for 2 straight years, close to 600 entries. My mother's appear around 30. My father's appear 110 times, which sounds like a lot until you notice that 80-some of those entries have no corresponding work logged beside them at all, just a signature, and nothing else. On days the yard's own tide and weather notes show no boats came in or went out. Some days my grandfather was sharp as ever, correcting my diagnosis on a stubborn outboard from clear across the yard without even looking up, remembering the hailing frequency and call sign of a boat that hadn't come through that channel in 15 years. Other days he called me by my uncle's name, Neil, and looked at me with an expression of such uncomplicated warmth that I let him. Being loved under the wrong name, I decided a long time ago, is still being loved, and I was never going to correct a man losing pieces of himself over technicality. In the fall of 2022, he started spending extra hours in the radio shack after the yard closed, not fixing anything, as far as I could initially tell, just sitting with the old base station, adjusting dials. Running cable, he said, was just for logging the weather broadcasts properly. He'd always kept the radio on some kind of standby recording capability, an old reel-to-reel setup he'd wired into the base station decades earlier so he could review overnight traffic if a mayday came through while he was asleep upstairs. I'd genuinely forgotten it still worked until that fall, when I noticed he'd started swapping the take-up reels far more often than the actual radio traffic could possibly justify. Your grandmother used to say a radio man only really learns to listen once he understands most of what matters gets said quiet, not loud, he told me one October evening, adjusting a dial with more care than the weather broadcast required. Everything else on this radio's just practice for the one channel that actually matters. Is this that channel? I asked, half joking. He didn't answer right away. He set down the headset, looked at me with a clarity that had been getting rarer that year, and said, "Not yet. But I'm keeping the one thing safe on this reel until you're ready to hear it." I didn't ask what he meant. I have spent a great deal of time since wishing that I had. What I didn't know that autumn, what none of us knew except, I would later learn, one very careful attorney and one increasingly uneasy retired Navy radioman living across the cove, was that my father had, 3 months earlier, sat down with a man from a regional seafood distributor in that same radio shack, with a folder of his own. The first thing I actually noticed and couldn't explain away, was small. In January, I stopped by the shack on a Sunday, which wasn't my usual day, to grab a spare filter my grandfather had asked me to pick up from the marine supply shop. My father was there, alone, going through the doc's business drawer with the particular unhurried thoroughness of somebody who believes he has every right to be doing exactly what he's doing. Sorting the insurance renewal paperwork, he said, before I'd asked. Somebody's got to keep this doc's books straight now. I didn't think much of it then. In February, my mother mentioned, over dinner, almost in passing, that Roger had met with somebody about simplifying Dad's business accounts, since the statements confuse him now. I asked which bank. My mother said she didn't remember and asked if I wanted more potatoes. In March, Cody posted on social media about an exciting next step for Marsh sport fishing charters. A second boat, a 32-foot center console he was finalizing financing on, with a caption thanking family for believing in the vision. A marine equipment financing notice I found much later, filed with the county, listed the down payment alone at $31,000. I want to be honest about something. None of these things, on their own, would have made me suspicious. Families move money around. Fathers help their sons. I'm not a person who assumes the worst about people by default. Ask anybody who's ever brought me a dead outboard at 6 in the morning. I am, if anything, famously slow to think badly of somebody's intentions. What changed my mind wasn't any single fact. It was the accumulation of small, specific, unexplained gaps between what I was being told and what I could plainly see with my own eyes at that dock every single day. The gap that finally cracked it open was a sign posted on the bait shack door. It went up in early April, a typed notice, laminated, announcing that as of June 1st, the commercial dock space along the North Wharf would be under exclusive lease to Bay State Seafood Company, and that fishermen who'd tied up there at the same fair rate for decades would need to make alternate arrangements. I called my father from the boatyard, standing in front of that laminated notice like it was written in a language I didn't recognize yet. Dad, there's a sign on the bait shack about the North Wharf going exclusive to some seafood company. Yeah, that's Bay State. Breezy, almost bored. Dad's always wanted more stability out of that dock than what the local guys pay. Dean, it's basically the same rates they've been paying since Reagan was president. Cody needs the capital for the second boat, and honestly it made sense. Dad said himself years back he wouldn't mind a company handling the North Wharf eventually once it got to be too much to run day to day. When did he say that? A pause. Just slightly too long. I don't remember the exact. Dean, does it matter? He's fine with it. I'd like to hear him say that himself. He's having an off week. Maybe next Sunday. I sat with my grandfather 4 days later. It was, by his own standards that spring, a good day, alert, oriented, correcting the tuning on the base station before I'd even finished adjusting it myself. I asked him, as gently as I knew how, about the notice on the bait shack door. He went very still. The particular stillness of a man trying to catch hold of a thought that keeps sliding just out of reach the moment he closes his hand around it. They keep bringing me papers, he said finally, staring out at the water instead of at me. I don't sign what I haven't read myself, plain, out loud, same as I never once logged a mayday I hadn't confirmed twice. I'm not starting now just because your grandmother's gone and nobody's double-checking my log entries anymore. What papers, Grandpa? Who's bringing you papers? He didn't answer that part. Instead, without any transition I could follow, he reached under the radio console and pulled out a small reel-to-reel tape, labeled only with a date in his own handwriting, and pressed it into my hands with a grip considerably firmer than his conversation had been a moment before. Take this home tonight, he said. Keep it somewhere dry and safe. Don't play it yet. You'll know when. I put it in my truck's glove box and drove home telling myself it was simply an old man's sentimental habit, a tape of some weather broadcast or old harbor traffic he wanted preserved. I put it in a showbox in my closet. I did not touch it again for nearly 5 months. If you've ever had the truth sitting right there in a glove box and simply weren't ready to press play yet, tell me in the comments. I promise you, you are not alone, and I was about to spend the better part of a year learning exactly how not alone. The second notice, a full-page ad in the regional fishing trade paper announcing Bay State Seafood's new exclusive partnership at historic Marsh Dock, ran in early July. That was the notice that made me stop being polite about any of it. I drove straight from the boatyard to the office of Owen Castellano, attorney, above the bank in the next town over, a firm that had handled Marsh family paperwork since before I was born. He drafted my grandparents' original trust in 1993, updated it twice, and had been my grandfather's attorney of record for close to 30 years. He saw me without an appointment, which by itself should have told me something. Dean. He didn't stand up right away. He looked at me like someone he'd been expecting, just not on this particular Tuesday. Sit down. I asked him, my hands not quite steady in my lap, whether my grandfather still had the legal capacity to sign an exclusive commercial lease, and whether he'd drafted anything for a deal like that. He went quiet for a moment. Then he turned to a filing cabinet and pulled a folder with Elias Marsh typed on the tab. I haven't drafted a single document for your grandfather in over a year, he said. Nothing's crossed my desk with his signature since his last trust review. But something did cross a different desk. He slid a photocopy across the table. Filed with the county recorder in October. A durable power of attorney, naming your father, Roger, sole agent over all of Elias Marsh's financial and property decisions. I looked at the signature at the bottom. It was close. Whoever produced it had clearly practiced. But the E didn't start high and settle the way his E had settled on every fuel invoice and boat title I'd watched him sign my entire life. The notarization is what concerns me most, Owen said, tapping the seal. This commission number belongs to a man named Gil Sanborn. I looked him up this morning. His registered business address is a UPS store mailbox 2 counties inland. I've never heard of him professionally, which in a coastline this small means something. Neither, it turns out, has the state notary registry. His commission lapsed 9 months before this document claims it was signed. I sat with that for a long moment. There's more, Owen said, his voice softening in a way that told me he'd been sitting on this, waiting for someone to walk through the door and ask exactly the right question. Your grandfather called this office in September. No appointment. Told my assistant it was urgent, and when I was in a closing and couldn't come to the phone, he left a message. I still have it. He turned his monitor toward me and pressed play. His voice, unmistakably his, a little slower than I remembered but entirely his own. Owen, it's Elias. My son keeps bringing papers around the dock and telling me it's simpler if I just sign where he's marked. I told him same as I've told every man who's ever crewed for me. You don't sign onto a voyage you haven't read the manifest for. I'd like you to come by when you've got a free afternoon. Bring whatever you've got on file. I want to know exactly what I own before anybody decides what to do with it. The message was dated September 9th. Owen told me he'd called the dock the following week to schedule a visit and had been told by my father himself, not my grandfather, that Dad's having a rough patch this month, might be best to hold off. He let it go longer than he should have, he admitted. I've handled maritime estates on this coast for 26 years, Dean. I know what a family means when they say we've got it handled instead of the person it's supposed to be protecting. I should have pushed harder. I'm telling you that honestly, because I think you're about to need to trust me completely, and I want you to know exactly where I fell short first. I asked what we could do. Right now, quietly, we document, he said. If your grandfather has capacity, and that message, dated in September, tells me he had plenty of it, then a forged power of attorney isn't just invalid, it's a crime. Elder financial exploitation, forgery of a notarized instrument, and depending how deep this goes, an authorized practice around that fake notary commission. But I need evidence solid enough it doesn't collapse into a family argument where both sides get written off as bitter. Go home. Watch. Write down every date, every dollar. And Dean, whatever your grandfather's given you recently, however ordinary it looked, I'd take a much closer look at it. I drove home that night and sat in my truck in the driveway a long time, looking at the showbox on my passenger seat where I'd finally moved that reel-to-reel tape after Owen's warning. Then I went inside, dug an old reel player out of my grandfather's storage shed that I'd fixed for him 2 winters back, and threaded the tape through with hands that weren't entirely steady. You'll know when. I pressed play. I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, and for the next hour, across 9 separate reel segments recorded over 10 months, my grandfather told me everything. The first segment was dated September 3rd, 6 days before his call to Owen. His voice was steady, unhurried, entirely his own, with the faint background hiss of the base station always running underneath it. This is Elias Marsh. Today is September the 3rd. I'm recording this off the shack's own logging reel because my son Roger has started bringing me papers I'm not allowed to read for myself first, and I know exactly what that means. I ran a radio for the Coast Guard for 6 years and this dock for 56 more, and I know when somebody's trying to get a signature logged before the operators had a chance to confirm the traffic. I'm keeping this reel where I know it'll be safe, and I'm building the case slow, on purpose, because slow is the only speed left where I still trust my own hands completely. He described the first meeting in detail, Roger arriving at the shack on a Thursday afternoon with a man from Bay State Seafood and a second man he introduced only as somebody to help with the notary work, asking my grandfather to initial several pages of a lease agreement without reading them aloud first. My grandfather had refused, politely, and asked for Owen's number, at which point, His words, on the recording, with a dry, weary amusement I recognized instantly as entirely his own. My son suddenly remembered he had a call coming in on his cell, and the three of them were off the dock before I'd even finished my coffee. The second segment, from the following week, described a follow-up visit. Same two men. This time Roger had brought a form partially filled out already and told him it was just the simplified version of what Owen's already got on file, so you don't have to bother him. My grandfather asked to keep a copy. Roger told him the copier at the marine supply shop was down. It was not down, my grandfather said on the recording, with the specific, weary precision of a man logging traffic he intended to matter later. I sent Dean in for filters 2 days after and asked him myself. Works fine. I want that on whatever record this turns out to be. By the fourth segment, dated in early November, his account had grown far more specific than I was prepared for. He described overhearing, through the thin shack wall, on an evening he believed his son didn't realize he was lucid enough to follow closely, a conversation between Roger and Cody about the boat financing and getting ahead of things before Owen's next review in the spring. He named a figure, $31,000, the exact down payment I would later confirm through the county's equipment financing filing on the new charter boat. They think because I forget where I set my reading glasses, I don't understand what $31,000 means, he said. I ran this doc's books in my head for half a century before your grandmother ever took over the ledger, and I understand exactly what $31,000 means. I understand it means the North Wharf, and I understand the rest of this dock isn't far behind it if nobody stops this. The sixth segment, from December, was the one that made me put a hand over my mouth and sit very still on that kitchen floor for several minutes before I could make myself press play on the seventh. I moved what I could, he said. Everything liquid, the savings, the certificates your grandmother and I built up over 50-some years, every dollar this dock ever earned that we didn't put back into new equipment. It's in a trust now that Owen doesn't even know exists yet, set up through an attorney 2 counties inland nobody in this family's ever heard of, on purpose, so nobody could go looking. $211,000. As of the day I'm recording this. It's not for taking. It's for the one man in this family who never once asked me for a thing and never once needed to be told twice to show up at this dock, rain, fog, or frost. Dean, if you're the one who found this, and I believe with everything left in this head of mine that you will be, because you're the only one who still asks me questions instead of handing me answers, that money is yours, and it always was, from the day I signed paperwork nobody in this family knows I signed. Take this reel to Owen. He'll know exactly what to do with it. I'm not confused, son. I want that said plain, one more time, onto a reel that can't forget it even after I do. I am careful. There's a difference, and your father's been counting on this whole harbor forgetting there's a difference for about a year now. The seventh segment, shorter, from February, his voice noticeably more tired though no less clear. One more thing. If this goes the way I think it's going to go, there's going to be a night where the whole harbor's together in one place, and somebody's going to want to make an announcement about this dock. Don't let them make it quiet, Dean. Your grandmother used to say the truth doesn't need you to raise your voice on a channel, it just needs you to say it where nobody can talk over it. Derby night. That's the one night every boat on this coast comes in together. If it isn't finished by then, that's where you finish it. The eighth segment, from April, ran barely 3 minutes, but it named the final piece of the scheme in plain, careful language. Last thing before I run out of clear afternoons to say it in. Bay State's real offer for exclusive use of that North Wharf was $92,000 a year, full market rate, on the papers their own regional manager left behind by accident in the shack one evening. What my son had me halfway signing put the dock's own take at $60,000, with the difference routed through a consulting fee to a company Cody's name shows up on as a listed officer. That's not an oversight. That's $32,000 a year, quietly moved somewhere it was never meant to go, stacked on top of everything else already gone. The ninth and final segment was dated in June, his voice slower, though the words landed with the same weight as everything before it. Last entry. Whatever anybody tells a judge about my mind these days, this shack's daily log has my handwriting in it nearly every working day for 2 straight years, steady as tide tables, right up until my hand started needing Dean to hold the page steady while I signed underneath it myself. Have Owen compare that signature, every single week of it, to whatever they try to put in front of a court with my name on it. A mind that confused does not keep a clean radio log for 2 years running. Mine still does, on my good days, and I had a great many good days while all this was happening. That's the whole argument, right there, in my own hand, and I built it slow, the way I've built everything worth keeping on this water, so that it would hold. I sat on that kitchen floor for a very long time after the reel ran out. Then I picked up the phone and called Owen Castellano at 9 o'clock at night, and he picked up on the second ring, which told me everything about how long he, too, had been waiting for this exact call. This is enough to open an investigation, Owen told me the next morning, sitting across his desk with the reel and its player between us like an exhibit in a museum case. But enough to open one and enough to win one are different animals, and I want to hand the county something so complete they don't have room to argue with it. Give me 8 weeks. I know that sounds long. I promise you it isn't, once you see what we're going to build. What followed was the strangest, quietest, most disciplined 2 months of my life. Owen brought in a forensic accountant named Theo Bramwell, a methodical, soft-spoken man who'd spent nearly 30 years untangling exactly this kind of thing for maritime and family estates across 3 counties. Within 3 weeks, working from bank records subpoenaed through the county's Adult Protective Services Division, he'd traced a pattern that made my grandfather's recordings look, if anything, conservative. Between August of the previous year and that June, $238,000 had moved out of accounts connected to Elias Marsh, some through the forged power of attorney directly, some routed more carefully through a dock modernization consulting fee my father had set up ostensibly to cover improvements to the North Wharf that, on closer inspection, had covered exactly 1 new set of dock cleats and the overwhelming majority of the down payment and outfitting costs on Cody's second charter boat, plus $32,000 a year in diverted lease rate difference that had been quietly moving since the initial deal closed. Your brother's charter operation, Theo told me, sliding a printout across the table, has received, directly or indirectly, somewhere between $80,000 and $110,000 from accounts belonging to a man diagnosed with early vascular dementia, who, according to this doc's own daily radio log, in his own handwriting, was actively and competently running this operation's paperwork nearly every single working day across the entire period in question. I asked, because I had to, whether Cody knew. That's the part numbers can't answer for me, Theo said. That's a question for a person, not a spreadsheet. Owen pulled the doc's own logbook, the same bound book I'd signed my initials into nearly every working day for 2 years, and laid it beside Theo's financial timeline. The 2 documents, in their own separate languages, told exactly the same story. My initials close to 600 times, my mother's around 30, my father's 110, 80 some of which corresponded to no actual dock activity at all. And laid beside it, a withdrawal timeline that accelerated sharply in exactly the month's visits and hands-on oversight from everyone except me had nearly stopped altogether. He also, quietly, and without telling me until it was done, tracked down the notary. Gil Sanborn turned out to be a real person, a retired marine electronics salesman who'd let his notary commission lapse and had, according to his own statement to Owen's investigator, helped a guy named Roger with some paperwork for cash, no questions asked, in a diner parking lot off Route 1. A fact he became considerably less relaxed about once he understood exactly what that paperwork had been used for. He agreed to a sworn statement in exchange for immunity on his own small piece of the exposure. It was, Owen told me, the kind of witness who turns a solid case into an airtight one, because a stranger with nothing left to protect rarely lies to save someone else's freedom. There was one more piece, and it came from a source none of us fully expected, though in hindsight I should have. Gus Pellety had lived across the cove from the dock for over 40 years, a retired Navy radioman himself who'd known my grandparents since before my mother was ever in the picture. He showed up at my door on a Wednesday evening in early September, holding a thermos of the coffee he always brought when he had something serious to say, and told me, without any preamble at all, that he'd not only watched a car he didn't recognize come and go from the shack's side door at least 5 separate times the previous autumn, but that he'd also, out of an old radioman's habit, kept his own scanner running on the harbor's working channels the whole time, and had a handful of overheard fragments on his own equipment logs that lined up, almost word for word, with what my grandfather had captured on his reel. "I mentioned the car to your mother once, at the grocery," Gus told me, sitting at my kitchen table with his hands wrapped around his own thermos cup. "Told her I'd seen somebody unfamiliar coming and going out at the dock. She told me I must be thinking of the propane delivery man. Dean, son, I ran a radio room for the Navy for 11 years. I know exactly what a propane truck sounds like coming up that gravel, and that was not one." He agreed, without my having to ask twice, to give a statement of his own, and handed over his own scanner logs with the dates and timestamps still in his own careful hand. By the second week of October, Owen had assembled a file nearly 4 inches thick: the forged power of attorney, the lapsed and misused notary commission, Theo's financial timeline, the doc's own daily logbook, Gus's statement, and his corroborating scanner logs, and 9 recorded reel segments spanning 10 months in a dying man's own unmistakable voice, describing in real time the exact scheme unfolding around him. "I've done this work for nearly 30 years, Owen told me, closing the folder. "I have rarely, if ever, seen a case document itself this completely. Your grandfather built this the exact same way he built everything else in his life. Slow. By hand. And exactly strong enough to hold." I want to pause here, because I don't think this story is honest if I let you believe my brother was simply standing quietly behind our father while he did all the work. It's more complicated than that, and I think complicated is closer to true. I drove out to the marina where Cody kept his boats in early October, 3 weeks before the derby, before Owen had said a word to anyone else. I hadn't planned to tell him anything. I told myself I just wanted to see his face when I asked one simple question. He looked tired. Genuinely tired, in a way that had nothing to do with performance, a stack of unpaid slip fees sitting on the console of the new boat, the particular hollowed-out exhaustion of a man watching a thing he built start to come apart slower than he can keep patching it. "The new boat's bleeding us dry," he told me, before I'd even asked anything, apparently just needing to say it out loud to somebody who wasn't going to ask him for money in response. I don't know how Dad keeps finding the capital for it. I stopped asking a while back, honestly. I just say thanks and try to keep the charters booked. "Do you know where the money's coming from, Cody?" He looked at me a long moment, and something in his face, not guilt exactly, but the ragged edge of a question he'd clearly been declining to finish asking himself for a while, answered before he said a word. "I know it's coming out of Grandpa's accounts," he said finally, quietly, not meeting my eyes. "Dad said it was a gift. Said Grandpa wanted to help me the way he'd helped you set up the mechanic shop years back. Said he didn't want a whole production made of it because it embarrasses him now, having people fuss over his business." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I told myself that was true because I needed it to be true, Dean. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I asked the hard questions. I didn't. I took the easy answer because the easy answer kept the boat in the water." I told him what Owen had found. I told him about the reel, the forged signature, the notary in a diner parking lot, the daily log with our father's name in it 110 times over 2 years, 80 some of them not real visits at all. I watched my brother, 28 years old, sit down hard on the gunwale of a boat he now understood had been half-funded with money stolen from a man who could no longer defend his own signature, and put his face in his hands. "What happens to me?" he asked, and it wasn't only a selfish question. It was the question of someone realizing, all at once, that willful blindness carries its own bill, even when someone else wrote the checks. I told him the truth, because he deserved that much. I didn't know. That was between him and Owen and, eventually, the county. What I did know was that he had 2 choices standing right in front of him: keep protecting the story that had funded his boat, or start telling the truth before someone made him. He chose the second one. 2 days later, on his own, without me asking, he called Owen's office and gave a voluntary statement. It didn't undo what the money had built. But it was, I think, the first fully honest thing my brother had done in this family's entire quiet economy of favors and silence, and I've never once regretted telling him the truth before Derby night instead of letting him find out with everyone else on the dock by late October. Owen's file had moved to Marcus Ferro, an investigator with the county's Adult Protective Services Division who specialized, as he put it in our first meeting, in the cases every relative insists couldn't possibly be that bad. Marcus reviewed everything over the course of a week, the real segments, Theo's financial timeline, Gus's statement, and scanner logs, Gil Sanborn's sworn account of the diner parking lot notarization, Cody's voluntary statement, the doc logbook. He came back with a straightforward assessment. Elder financial exploitation exceeding $150,000 was a felony in this state carrying significant prison time, and forgery of a notarized instrument was a separate charge entirely. Combined with the diverted lease rate scheme, he told Owen, this was as clean a referral for arrest as I've had cross my desk in years. The warrant application went to the county court in early November. It was signed within the week. The timing works in our favor, Marcus told us, the three of us sitting with a calendar between us. Derby Awards night is the 16th. If your grandfather wanted this handled in front of the whole harbour, we can do that exactly the way he asked. Officers in plain clothes, ready on my signal, present but not visible until it matters. I asked him, because I had to, what would happen to my father? That's not really my question to answer, Marcus said, not unkindly. It's the courts, eventually. What I can tell you is the evidence in this file doesn't leave much room for interpretation about who directed this. I've seen families argue their way out of thinner cases than this one. I don't expect that's going to happen here. I spent the week before the Derby doing something I hadn't done in a long time. I drove down on a Wednesday, not my usual shift, just to sit with my grandfather in the radio shack. He was having a difficult day, mostly quiet, mostly somewhere I couldn't quite follow him to. But at one point, holding my hand the way he used to when I was small enough to need help down the dock ramp, he said, without any obvious connection to what we'd been talking about, "Did you find it? The one channel that mattered." "I found it, Grandpa." He smiled, small, satisfied, the same smile, I imagine, he wore every time a boat he'd talked through a bad night on the radio finally made it back into the harbour safe. "Good," he said. "Then it's done. Whatever happens now, it's already done. I built it slow so it would hold." The Harlow Point Fishing Derby's Awards night happens the third Saturday of every October, on the main wharf itself, folding tables strung with string lights, a fish fry the volunteer fire department runs every year, and, at 7 o'clock, the Derby's biggest event. The announcement of the tournament's top catches, followed, that particular year, by an announcement my father had been planning for months. He'd arranged, weeks earlier, to take the small stage set up beside the scale house at 7:30 and formally introduce an exciting new chapter for Marsh Dock. The Bay State Partnership, framed as smart, forward-looking modernization that would keep this dock thriving for another 50 years. What he didn't know was that the lease deal had quietly collapsed 4 days earlier, the moment Bay State's own legal department, alerted by a formal notice from Owen's office, discovered a trust document filed months prior by an attorney 2 counties inland, making unmistakably clear exactly who held true authority over that dock and every dollar tied to it. I stood near the back of the crowd with Owen and Marcus Ferro, Cody beside me, unusually still, unusually quiet. Gus Pelletier stood a few feet away in his good flannel, arms crossed, watching my father climb the small stage steps with the expression of a man who had been waiting a long time to see something finished properly. My father took the microphone. He thanked the Derby Committee, thanked the volunteer fire department, thanked, with a straight face I will remember for the rest of my life, my father, for building something this harbour could count on for over 50 years, and for trusting us to carry it forward into a new era exactly the way he'd have wanted. Owen walked up the ramp before the applause had finished, laptop under one arm, and asked, with the calm, unhurried courtesy of a man who's done this exact thing before, for 2 minutes of everyone's attention. The real segments played through the Derby's own PA system, patched in through a volunteer sound tech Owen had arranged with the committee's blessing a week earlier. My grandfather's voice, steady, unmistakable, entirely his own, that same faint hiss of the base station underneath it, filled the wharf where he'd talked half this harbour's boats safely home for over 50 years. This is Elias Marsh. Today is September the 3rd. I'm recording this off the shack's own logging reel because my son Roger has started bringing me papers I'm not allowed to read for myself first. The crowd that had known him 50 years went from murmuring to absolutely silent within the first 30 seconds. By the time his voice reached the part about the $211,000, about the trust set up 2 counties inland, about the line, That money is yours, and it always was. I watched my father's face do something I had genuinely never seen it do in 31 years. It simply stopped performing. All at once, with nowhere left to arrange itself, it just stopped. Marcus Ferro stepped forward as the final segment ended. Two officers in plain clothes moving quietly from the edge of the crowd toward the stage stairs. There was no shouting. No dramatic scene across the wharf. Just Marcus, calm and clear, informing my father he was being placed under arrest on charges of elder financial exploitation and forgery of a notarized instrument, and my father, for the first time in my entire life, saying absolutely nothing at all in response. My father's case is still moving through the county court system as of this recording. His attorney has signaled an intention to negotiate a plea rather than go to trial, which Owen tells me is, given the completeness of the file, the only decision that makes sense from where he's sitting. Whatever the outcome, the forged power of attorney has already been formally voided, and the diverted lease rate scheme has been flagged as part of the broader exploitation charge. The dock remains exactly where it always belonged. My mother, notably, has not been charged. Marcus's investigation found no evidence she did anything beyond what she's done her entire marriage, which is defer to my father and ask no questions she didn't want the answers to. Whether that makes her innocent or simply a different kind of complicit is, I think, a question this family will be quietly arguing for a long time. Marsh Sport Fishing Charters is restructuring. Cody kept the new boat, financed now through a proper marine equipment loan he applied for and secured entirely on his own. The first thing, he told me, he's ever built without somebody else quietly absorbing the risk underneath him. We talk most weeks now. It isn't the relationship we had growing up. It might, slowly, be a better one. The trust opened exactly the way my grandfather arranged it, through the attorney 2 counties inland, precisely as the 6th reel segment described. $211,000, along with formal, undisputed ownership of the dock and the boatyard, transferred into my name in December. I haven't sold any of it. I'm still down at that same yard most working days, running the mechanical side same as always, and I've started keeping the radio shack open in the evenings the way he used to, mostly out of habit, partly because Gus still comes by some nights with his own thermos to sit and listen to Channel 68 with me. The sign still says Marshes. I haven't decided yet whether to change it, and some days I think that not deciding is its own kind of answer. My grandfather is still with us, still some days sharp and some days somewhere I can't quite follow. Some evenings he knows exactly who I am. Some evenings he calls me Neil, and I let him, same as always, because being loved under the wrong name is still, and will always be, being loved. I bring him coffee from the shop by the wharf. I tell him about the boats that came through that day. I don't tell him, most weeks, everything that happened after Derby night, because I don't think he needs the details anymore. I think, somewhere underneath the parts of him this illness has taken, he already knows the one channel he spent the better part of a year keeping open actually held. I kept that reel in the same showbox, on a shelf in the radio shack now instead of my closet. I never did erase it or record over it, the way you might with any ordinary tape once its message has already been delivered. Some things, once they've already told you everything you needed to hear, are better left exactly the way the person who recorded them intended. If you've ever been the one still showing up at the dock every single day while everyone else was busy signing papers behind your back, tell me in the comments what your family called you instead of what you actually were. I read every single one. And if this story found you at the right moment tonight, share it with the person in your life who's still doing the showing up, they'll know exactly why.